so I still mention it. And also that in a later study they found therapists in training, so not med school students, but therapists in training, had significant declines in stress, negative affect, rumination, anxiety, and they had increases in positive emotion and self-compassion. So again, this is focusing on the individual, like I was talking about earlier, and yet I think it's important to mention because it's focusing on students in training to be in healthcare settings, to be in service of others. And stress may harm professional skills through impacts on attention, decision-making, and burnout. So, and also that burnout and distress have been significantly associated with decreased patient satisfaction and quality of care. So again, just to say that mindfulness training might promote a greater capacity to be present with our clients in the face of their distress, and not be so, not have this distress contagion which leads to burnout down the road and contributes to decreased satisfaction in patient care. Also, in social cognitive neuroscience, the theory of mind, that both major theories within theory of mind, simulation theory and theory as they're called. Simulation theory being this idea that we infer the mental states of others through trying on their experience within ours. Mirror neurons are associated with this simulation theory. We try their experience on within our own experience. We simulate it, and then we can infer their mental states. And theory being more like we just make a cognitive conjecture about what the other person is, what's going on in their minds due to observable behaviors. And both, whichever side of the argument you fall down on, and there's evidence for both, mindfulness training seems to affect areas of the brain that are implicated in both of these ways of inferring the mental states of others. Individual differences on self-reported empathy, as I talked about earlier, associated with increased mirror-like activations in the insula. And activation of the medial prefrontal cortex has been implicated in imagining the mental states of others, perspective taking as well. And then Lutz and colleagues in their study in 2008 found that both experts and novices had increased activation in circuitry associated with the theory of mind. And the pattern was increased as amount of meditation experience went up. So moving into this last section on the more subtle influences that one person's mindfulness practice or training the mind might have on another, I'm just setting the context here for the emerging paradigm of social cognitive neuroscience and its role in how we think about the human mind and the self. As Cassiopo, a social neuroscientist, says, we can't really understand human behavior by studying one nervous system in isolation. In fact, we need to study at least two nervous systems in an interaction with one another in order to understand human behavior more completely. And so he's comparing it to the old paradigm to studying a solitary desktop computer, and the new one almost like being plugged into the internet. And so from this perspective, the self is innately relational. It grounds the self and mind in an embodied and relational framework. So again, just setting the context for this latter section, in which I'm going to be talking about social contagions. So behavioral contagion, so again going from the order we'll be moving in is from gross to subtle. So behavioral contagion, there's a number of behavioral contagions that have been found. I just mentioned a few here. Fear transmission being one that I think is particularly important to us as clinicians. But also the ability and the capacity of therapists to identify and express their own emotions that might be increased or picked up on by the client through us modeling that. The client might therefore start to perceive, identify, and express their emotions better. Also fear transmission, so if we're just adding distress to the client's own distress when they're in extreme states of mind, we might not be helping out too much in terms of promoting working with these states of mind. So through contemplative development, we might develop what's called in Buddhism the lion's roar, which is this fearless proclamation that all states of mind are workable. We discover this through our own practice, through working with our own mind, that no matter how extreme it gets, it's a workable state. And so the capacity of the therapist to stay present with the client who's in an extreme state of mind, no matter how extreme, and hold that perspective that this is workable. Imagine the power of that as a client. So you're not adding the stress to the distress. You're not promoting fear transmission. Cognitive contagion, more subtle level cognition. that certain Buddhist views, regardless of the client's religious affiliation, might be helpful to the client, such as the impermanence of thoughts and emotions. And basic goodness, this idea within Buddhism, which is actually quite contrary to what most of us grow up with, which is the idea of original sin. So this concept of basic goodness, that we are fundamentally good. So if the therapist can hold that perspective and see their client from this perspective, then perhaps their client over time implicitly starts to pick up on this kind of idea as well. And Buddhist views may also serve to disrupt worldview coherence through incorporating new perspectives and new views into the client's worldview, which would promote worldview development. Emotional contagion. So Malmo, as early as 1957, it was found that when a therapist was having a bad day, as recorded in their journals, they had a bad day, it was associated with their client's heart rate being increased during the session. So significantly, their heart rate increased. And the only explicit thing that they could find had changed within how the therapist was performing the therapy was a slight change in voice pitch. So the treatment was still looking exactly the same, and yet the slight change in voice pitch accelerated the heart rate significantly. So some mechanisms that emotional contagion is hypothesized to spread through are mimicry and synchronization, now more recently perhaps mirror neurons. And through contemplative development, the greater capacities for empathy might promote more emotional resonance with our clients. Limbic resonance is sometimes called. And also better emotional regulation could be caught by the client. And more positive emotions could also be shared between the client and the therapist. And lastly, moving to the most subtle level, this is speculative, I admit, but this is my interest. This is just a Buddhist story here. In the Mahabharata scriptures, this great teacher, Venerable Assaji, is walking past Shariputra. And Shariputra notices that this is a great teacher. I'd never seen him before, but notices just because his every movement is consummate. His every movement is perfectly skilled, coordinated. And after a brief interaction with Venerable Assaji, Shariputra returns to the village where his friend Mogiyana says, "Hey, what's happened to you? Now you're pure and clear." And so just a brief interaction with Venerable Assaji seemed to have changed Shariputra. And move on. So this is perhaps pointing to an infectious, perhaps contagious quality of attentional processing, or mindfulness. So I define attentional contagions, it's my own research I'm working on back in Europa. It's a process whereby the attentional processing of one or more individuals induces similar attentional processing in at least one other. And this may happen via mechanisms similar to emotional contagion, where if attentional processing or different types of attentional processing are observable, they might also be mimicable. And so I posit that they could be observable actually in the overall coherence of emotion, action, and cognition, as opposed to any one of these things on its own. So you can think of it as almost like a self-regulation contagion. So perhaps by the therapist having a better self-regulatory capacity, that's transferred to the client just by virtue of sitting in one another's presence. And how can this have clinical implications? How can this be used in a clinical setting? Exchange, Wegela 2008. This is a contemplative psychotherapy concept. Wegela is going to be sitting on a panel this summer in Boulder, Colorado with Daniel Siegel and Jack Kornfield. She's a well-known therapist, and she's also professor of the